The Astair Tee has a casual boxy fit, a split hem and 2 sleeve options. View A has short cuffed sleeves and View B has long bracelet length sleeves. Because of the boxy shape, your most important measurement is going to be your bust. I have a 34-inch bust and I'm making a size B. Have a look at your finished garments measurements to make sure that you have enough ease in the hips. My hips are 37, so technically I should grade out to a size C at the bottom, but I find the split hem gives me a very comfortable fit in the hips in the size B. I'm making View A on the sewing machine with the striped fabric. To determine whether your fabric has enough stretch, you place a pin to mark the beginning and the end of the first original length rectangle on the diagram provided in your pattern instructions and stretch it to see how far it comfortably stretches. I'm making View B on the overlocker in this black and white floral fabric. You can easily test stretch percentage with a ruler too if you don't have this page printed out. So you place your first pin at the beginning of the ruler and your second pin at a mark, like say for instance 10 centimeters. Then if your fabric comfortably stretches to 12 centimeters, you have 20% stretch. The recommended fabric for this pattern is light to medium weight knits with a moderate 20 to 40% stretch. Ballpoint or jersey needles have a rounded tip designed to avoid breaking fibers in knits and fabrics with spandex. They glide in between the fabric threads rather than piercing through them. These needles are perfect for cotton knits, viscose knits, or any knit fabric with a looser weave. Universal needles usually have a slight ballpoint tip, which is why these needles also work for stitching knit fabrics, but they're not designed for knits like true ballpoint or stretch needles. If your fabric has a high synthetic content or a very high lycra or spandex content, you might want to use stretch needles. The stretch needle is great for sewing in elastic or sewing garments like swimwear. If you find your ballpoint needle skip stitches, try a stretch needle. Twin needles come in universal and stretch. This needle is used to produce a professional looking hem finish or top stitching finish with 2 rows of stitches on the right side and a zigzag on the wrong side. At the bottom of the pack we are given 2 numbers. We're given the 4/75. So the first number 4 means the distance between the 2 needles. So this particular one measures 4 millimeter between the 2 needles. The second number, 75, is the size of the needle. Usually 70 is for lighter weight fabrics like viscose knit, 80 would be for medium weight like cotton knit, and then 90 for heavier weights like ponte or scuba. For my fabric I use the 75 for plain hems where I'm only stitching over 2 layers of fabric. I have found using this thinner size over bulkier seam like top stitching a neckband for instance always results in skip stitches. So I use a thicker size needle like a 90 for thicker seams. I couldn't find a thicker size in the stretch however, so I use a universal and have never had any issues. For a zigzag to sew a normal stretch seam, select the zigzag stitch, a length of 2.5 and a width of 1 to 1.5. To demonstrate what a difference the width will make, I'm also sewing a sample with a width of 3. Here we have the two samples. The wider zigzag has more stretch, but when the seams pull apart, you'll have a substantial ladder of stitches on show. The narrower zigzag has less stretch, but definitely enough to ensure that your stitches withstand the stretch of your garment. Stitches will be slightly visible if the seam is pulled apart like on a tight garment with negative ease, but if sewn in a matching color to your fabric, they won't be noticeable. The triple stretch stitch, also known as the back stitch, is the most durable of the stretch stitches. On my machine it's indicated as 3 rows of stitches. I love using this stitch for my kids' clothes and always use it for crotch seams, even on woven garments. It's durable and allows for a certain amount of wearing stretch. As you can see, it's stitched with 2 stitches forward, 1 stitch back. The drawback to this stitch is that it takes longer and it's near impossible to unpick. This stitch lies beautifully flat and is my favorite of all the stretch stitch options. Another popular stretch stitch is the lightning stitch. If your machine offers this, it's well worth a try. One way of sewing a quick stretch hem is with either a plain zigzag or a 3-stitch zigzag. For these, you will select your zigzag at a length and width of 2.5 or 3 for heavier knits. The twin needle gives a beautiful professional looking hem or top stitch finish. The settings for our twin needle is a straight stitch at a length of 3 and a width of 0. If you don't have 2 spools of your desired colored thread, then simply wind a full bobbin off of your spool and use that for your second needle. For twin needle you need 2 threads for your top needles and 1 as per usual for your bobbin case. As you can see, my machine has a little hole behind my bobbin winder. This is a place where I can fit an additional spool of thread for the twin needle, but seeing as we are using a bobbin for our second thread, we can simply disengage the winder and then use the bobbin holder. Thread your machine with both threads as per usual. Like other machine sewing needles, the shank of the needle is flat on the back and rounded at the front. I found the best way to thread the twin needle so that the 2 threads never twist round each other is to take the first thread and put it through both the top hook and the hook just above the blue area of the needles. However, thread the second thread only through the top hook and not through the hook above the needles. This separates the threads and I've never had a problem with them twisting together. An additional step you could do is to place your 2 top threads winding in opposite directions to each other. You can't backstitch with a twin needle. It causes tension problems with the zigzag at the bottom and can result in skipped stitches and tension issues. So simply stop and start your seam without backstitching. We will be securing the threads by knotting them together on the wrong side. The first line I sewed with my machine's tension at the normal number 4 setting. The second line I'm sewing with a much higher tension of 9. You can see the top stitches look slightly looser, but the true indicator is at the back. The top zigzags are pulling and aren't zigzag shaped at all, but the bottom setting is giving us zigzags, which indicates that the bottom tension is what we need to go with. You might find in your lighter weight knits that this high tension will cause tunneling. This is when the fabric bunches up in a pronounced bump between your 2 lines of stitches. You could reduce your tension, but it's very important to note that the lower your tension of your twin needle, the less stretch there will be in your stitches, and you run the risk of them popping. So the best way to prevent tunneling on your lightweight knits is to use a medium to high tension that shows beautiful zigzags in the back, but use lightweight stretch interfacing or wash away stabilizer. Anything that will stabilize your fabric where you will be stitching but still stretch with your fabric. The threads on knit fabrics are held together in continuous loops. Breaking any can lead to major unraveling. So these ballpoint pins, like ballpoint needles, have a more rounded tip to penetrate in between the knit threads, rather than sharp pins that might pierce right through the fibers. However, in all my years of sewing, I've only had a regular sharp pin snag and create a hole in my knit fabric twice, and thankfully it was within the seam allowance on one of those occasions. The drawback to these pins are that they have plastic rather than glass heads, so I can't press on them with my iron as I do with my sharp glass head pins. It's important to judge the weight of your project against the thickness of your pins. I only had these medium weight ones available to me. As you can see, it's quite a bit thicker than my fine sharp pins. This has left a temporary gap in my lightweight knits before, but as soon as the steam hits it, the fibers come together again and closes the gap. In conclusion, the best case scenario, which I can judge from my own experience, is to use thin ballpoint pins if they are available to you. If not, then you can use regular sharp pins. They're perfectly fine, but make sure to always pin within the seam allowance. Make sure you marked all your notches on your pocket, sleeve cuffs and lower side seams. I'm going to mark the centers of my neckband and both front and back necklines by folding them in half and snipping a notch, or you could use a pin or fabric marker. With right sides facing together, fold the back and front hems up along the fold lines. I'm folding mine according to my stripes and matching them. Stitch at a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. With right sides facing, pin and stitch both shoulder seams. You can reinforce your seam with a strip of stretch stay tape, or you could use clear elastic. I don't have any, but I find that using this triple stretch stitch on my sewing machine is definitely secure enough to still have some wearing stretch, but it gives enough stability so that the shoulder seams don't stretch out of shape. Pin the short ends of your neckband together, right sides facing. Sew at a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press the seam open. With wrong sides together, fold your binding in half along its length and press. This is optional, but if you have fabric like mine that likes to curl a lot, it's going to make putting in the neckband a little bit more tricky. So what I like to do is to zigzag the edge. I'm using a wide zigzag of 2.5 length and width, and I'm just zigzagging the two edges together. At this point the edges are still going to want to curl up, so just take it slow and lift up the presser foot if you need to straighten things out. It's better to deal with the curling now than when you've got the 3 layers you're trying to put together with the neckband and the neckline. I've given this a steam with my iron and it's laying nice and flat now, and it will still stretch because we used a zigzag stitch. We are now going to divide the neckband into quarters, so we're going to place a pin at the back seam and at the front notch we made earlier on. Take those 2 pins and place them together, and now when you flatten out the neckband you'll have your other quarter points. Divide your neckband edge into quarters as well. You're going to take the back notch and the front notch that we made to indicate the centers and bring them together. Then evenly match the raw edges together so that it's in half, and then that will be the other quarter points. Because I'm working with stripes, I'm just having a really quick look to see if the stripes match up and if my points are at the same stripe. With the right side of the garment facing me, I'm matching up the center back seam of the neckband with the center back of my garment, and then I'm matching up all of those quarter points together. Now the neckband is slightly smaller than the neckline, so we're going to have to stretch the neckband. It's important that we only stretch the neckband and not the neckline. So I'm taking each quarter section and then I'm pinning it in place. Removing the extension table of your machine will make it easier to sew your neckline. If you have your garment facing up towards you and the neckband at the bottom, you'll find it's really easy to control the stretching. So the most important thing here is that you are stretching your neckband to meet the length of your neckline. Your neckline is not being stretched at all, it's just keeping its original shape. Because we sewed the raw edges of the neckband together with the zigzag earlier, you can see that I've got no problems with it curling underneath my work. You can now give your neckband a good press and steam. If you wish to, you could top stitch the front neckline, but we are going to be doing a different finish for the back neckline. Take your back neck reinforcement strip and fold the seam allowances by 1 centimeter on the short edges. This strip will encase the back neckline seam. With the right side of your reinforcement strip facing the inside of your neckband, match it at the shoulder seams and then pin matching the edge of your reinforcement strip with the edge of your binding. You can now sew this at a 6mm 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can sew this section with a straight stitch. I sewed it with a 2.5 length straight stitch. As you can see, when I'm going to fold this over, there's going to be quite a bit of bulk. My fabric is a medium weight cotton knit, so I'm going to be grading down some of these seam allowances. I'm leaving my neckband intact and grading down the seam allowances on either side of it. Now I can fold over the reinforcement strip and pin it in place. We are going to be stitching on that folded edge now. This line of stitches is going to be very visible from the right side of the garment, so just take your time. I'm also stitching this with a 2.5 length straight stitch. Pin the side seams together. We are going to be starting the seam at the top of that folded hem. Make sure your fabric isn't curled underneath. Sew both your side seams in this way. With right sides together, pin and sew the short ends of your sleeve cuffs. Press your seam open. Fold and press your cuff with wrong sides together. I'm matching my fold with one of my stripes. If you have stripes, determine which side of your cuff you want to be the right side. Our cuff is going to be sewn on and then it's going to be folded up again. So this is going to be the right side that's going to show, which means that I need to place the wrong side of my cuff to the right side of my garment. I'm starting by matching the seam on my cuff to the side seam of my garment. Then I'm going to match up my top notches on my cuffs to my shoulder seam. Using our normal seam allowance and a stretch stitch, we're going to stitch the cuff to the armhole. I feel like this is a bit bulky for my fabric, so I'm just going to trim the inside seam allowance. As you can see, my fabric's rolling a lot and it's going to make the next step a little bit more tricky, so I'm going to do the same as the neckband and I'm zigzagging the raw edges together. Press that seam allowance towards the garment and then top stitch. I'm using a zigzag of 2.5 stitch length and width. This stitching is not going to be seen. On the inside, measure up 1 centimeter from your seam line, and that's where you're going to fold up your cuff. We're going to be sewing down this bottom seam line and tacking down the cuff at the shoulder. Using a threaded hand sewing needle, I'm bringing up the knot at the back of that shoulder seam. Now I'm coming up on the edge of that cuff and I'm going to be doing an invisible tack stitch on the inside of the cuff. At this point I'm making sure only to catch the bottom layer of the cuff. Now I'm just securing the thread with a knot on the seam allowance. Match up the bottom seam of your cuff with the side seam of your garment. I'm sewing the small little section with a 2.5 length straight stitch. Turn out the hems and shape the corners. Now you can press up the hem and pin it in place. You can stitch down your hem with a zigzag or a double needle. Remember, we are not back stitching. If you wish to, you can trim off the excess seam allowance. I pulled the two top threads towards the back and I'm knotting it with a bobbin thread. With right sides facing, pin down the top of your pocket at the fold line. We are going to be stitching this at a 1 cm seam allowance. For the top I am using a 2.5 stitch length and then I'm using a basting stitch length of 3 to 4. Fold the corners right side out. Press the edges in along the basting line. I've just turned this bit up to see the seam allowance and make sure that my double needle is going to hit onto the seam allowance. So I've determined I need to place my fabric at the 1.5 cm mark. Don't be alarmed if your fabric is slightly wavy after sewing. A little steam always solves this. An easy way to pull the two front threads through to the back is to find the little loop and pull on it. This will pull the threads through. If you can't find this loop, just lightly pull on the bobbin thread and the loop will appear. We are going to place our pocket by using our pocket placement markings from our pattern. Take your pocket and simply line it up with those markings. I've got the added help of stripes to help me line everything up. I'm now going to pin my pocket to my garment. To demonstrate the character and ability of the twin needle, I'm going to be using it to stitch around my pocket. You can, however, use any stitch that you like for top stitching your pocket. Even a straight stitch would work. The twin needle can only stitch in one straight line. It can't pivot on corners, as you will see soon. So I'm stitching down in one straight line to the end. I'm going to have to pull those threads through to the back now and knot them. I'm lining up my needle with the previous line of stitching and then stitching down the next edge. We will not be able to pivot with our needle down over here, so I've got my needle slightly raised and just gently pivoting. I hope that gave you a clear view and demonstration of the ability of the twin needle. If you wanted a similar effect, you could just do 2 lines of straight stitches, which means you could pivot at the corners and do it all in one go. Mark your centre necklines by folding them in half and making a mark with either a marker, a pin or a notch. Always test your overlocking on a spare piece of fabric. I like to test my overlocking on a single layer when I'm going to be overlocking a single layer like the bottom of a hem, and then when I'm sewing a double layer like a seam, I will test again to make sure that my tension is correct. Overlock the bottom edges of the front and back hem. Using your fold line notches towards the bottom of your side seam, fold up the hem with right sides together. Pin it in place. Sew the sides of your folded hem on a sewing machine. We are using a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance and a stretch stitch. With right sides facing, pin and overlock your shoulder seams. You can stabilize this by using stretch stay tape or clear elastic. With right sides facing, overlock the short ends of your neckband together. This is going to be very bulky when you fold it over, so fold it over and mark the middle, and then we're going to snip through the seam allowance up until the stitch line but not through it. Now take those seam allowances and fold them in the opposite direction. Mark the halfway point and then the 1/4 points of your neckband. Place the previously marked front and back center necklines together. Fold the neckline in half and then you will find your 1/4 marks. With right sides facing, place the raw edges of your neckband to the raw edges of your neckline. We are going to match up all of the 1/4 points. Remember that your neckband is smaller than your neckline. I also matched up the seam in my neckband with the center back of the neckline. I'm now taking each 1/4 section and matching up the neckline with the neckband and pinning everything in place. I like to start my overlocking on the side close to one of the side seams. It's important that we only stretch the neckband and not the neckline. For this version, I'm going to be top stitching the neckline down with a twin needle. You can do this by lining up the neckline seam between your two needles, or you can let both your needles fall on the garment side of the seam. The purpose here is to sew the seam allowance of the neckband to the garment. As you can see, we have a very clean back seam because we started our overlocking over here on the side where nobody can see it. Overlock the hems of your sleeves. With right sides together, pin your sleeve to the body of your garment. Match up the shoulder notch on your sleeve with your shoulder seam. Stitch both your sleeves on your overlocker. Matching your underarm seams, pin your sleeve and your side seam. Pin your side seam down to the notch at your hem. Lift up the presser foot on your overlocker and make sure you get that right under the needle so that your stitches start right at that notch on the top of your hem. If you want to finish off your tail neatly, take a few stitches, lift up your presser foot, and then take the tail and pull it through to the front. You are now going to sew over that tail for a couple of stitches and then cut it off. Turn out the hems and shape your corners. Press your hem and pin in place. Stitch your hem down using a twin needle or a zigzag stitch. I'm lightly pulling on the bobbin thread to get those two little loops to pull through the two top threads towards the back, and then I'm knotting them to secure them. Turn up your sleeve hem, and as we did with the neckband, we're going to snip and distribute the seam allowance so that it reduces bulk. Now measure and pin your sleeve hems. Stitch your sleeve hems with your preferred stretch stitch.